Mani Napudni, Nine Nari Nat. Welcome. It's great that you came today. My name is Nat Giffney and I'm a Sustainable Urban Communities Officer at Green Adelaide. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and our guests to this afternoon's Green Adelaide Seminar Series talk on diving into blue carbon. Nugli Tumpanthi, Nugli Ghana Yatanga Imprenthi. I acknowledge that Ghana are the custodians of this land. And as we're here today to talk about our coastlines and marine ecosystems, I acknowledge that Ghana have cared for the coastline of their country for tens of thousands of years. This is the 9th instalment of the Green Adelaide Seminar Series, which we are holding to help share the great work happening to make Adelaide cooler, greener, wilder, and more climate resilient. So this session is being recorded and will be made available on a Green Adelaide YouTube channel playlist. And I'll send you all a link after this session. So please share that with your networks. The format for today's session, I realise I'm not sharing my slides, just give me a moment. We'll have a 40-minute presentation. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So you don't have access to your cameras or microphones today. So please use the Q&A function or the chat function to be able to ask your questions. We encourage you to put them in there along the way. Ask them when you have the questions so you remember at the end. And we'll get to as many of those as we can. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sophie Russell and Dr. Emily Leyden, who will be sharing with us about how blue carbon ecosystems like seagrass meadows, mangroves and salt marshes are some of the most efficient natural carbon sinks on the planet. These ecosystems capture and store large amounts of carbon for hundreds to thousands of years. Dr. Emily Leyden is a soil scientist and postdoctoral researcher in the Biochemical Research Group at the University of Adelaide. And Dr. Sophie Russell is an ecologist and postdoctoral researcher in the Future Coast Lab, also at the University of Adelaide. Thank you, Emily and Sophie, so much for joining us today. I'm absolutely, personally, really excited to learn more with you and from you on these critically important ecosystems. And I'll hand over to you to take us through your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, Nat, and thanks everyone for coming along today. We're excited to talk to you a bit about blue carbon in South Australia and what's going on here. So like Nat mentioned, I'm Sophie Russell. I'm a researcher at Adelaide University in the Future Coast Lab Group, and I work on nearshore and coastal ecosystems, looking at their potential for climate change mitigation, and that involves monitoring the biodiversity and all sorts of other benefits, as well as modelling the carbon storage potential of these ecosystems. I'm really passionate about providing natural climate solutions that can help us into the future.
G'day, my name is Emily. I'm a soil scientist and I work in the Biogeochemistry Research Lab here at the University of Adelaide. I've always been fascinated with natural ecosystems and their complexity. I'm always fascinated about how little we actually know about these ecosystems. And so I really enjoy the research that I do. I work in soils and sediment, and soils are even more complex because often, and less research because we can't see them easily. So I work on the soils and sediments within the coastal zone. So this is the mud and the sands that border our land. And these soils have a really interesting set of biogeochemistry because essentially they're wet. And so their chemistry functions really uniquely compared to our terrestrial soils. So I work on a bunch of projects at the moment on the coast, primarily looking at areas that have been changed by European sediment, so often bunded systems from the tide, and working out ways that we can introduce the tide again to these areas and then what benefits that can get us in terms of carbon abatement, but also biodiversity benefits and so economic, social and environmental benefits from tidal restoration. So really looking forward to present this topic to you today. And so without further ado, we might get started. All right, so I thought the best place to start is at the top, and that's with climate change. And so we know that climate change is occurring, and the main reason for climate change occurring in the most recent of our history, since the Industrial Revolution, has been since the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane into our atmosphere. And so this graph shows you the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And so what scientists have done is they've taken some ice cores They know what level of ice was laid down when, and they take little tiny bubbles from that ice core and measure the concentration of carbon within that. And then they can work out what the concentration of carbon has been in our atmosphere from 800,000 years ago to present. And what is starkly obvious here is the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is greater than it has been since the time 800,000 years ago. So it really is unprecedented, the amount of carbon dioxide. And this is primarily through human activities, so the burning of fossil fuels, changing land use, and the other human activities which we do that release these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And so each year, human beings release around 35 gigatons or 35 billion tonnes of CO2 per year. And so since the Industrial Revolution, that accounts for about 300 gigatons, 300 billion tonnes of CO2. And what we know is that when we release this amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, what we do is we increase surface heat, so we warm the surface. And so these graphs give us an indication of the increase in surface temperature over the most recent history and the ocean on the other side. And we know this is happening because greenhouse gases are really good at absorbing heat. And so if you look at that graph on the left, you might think, okay, well, 1 degree, does that really matter? In fact, a lot of evidence, we have a huge body of evidence now that shows small changes in temperature have large impacts for our planet in terms of biodiversity and climate change. That's really well-established research now. And one of the main changes which we see when we have a warming planet is sea level rise. And so I've got a graph down the bottom here that shows predicted sea level rise to 2100 under 2 different emission scenarios. And so this graph I'll be using a bit during my part of the talk. And so in the blue there, you can see 2.6. And so that's an emission scenario where if today we cut all our emissions globally, we stopped land destruction and we put a whole lot of things in place to reduce our emissions. And importantly, we're still going to see to 2100 global sea level rise of around about 50 centimetres. If we continue business as usual, and that's in the red there at 8.5, what we'll see is a global sea level rise of probably about above a metre. And so the additional data on this graph shows you where that comes from. So when we heat the surface, we melt things. And typically that is ice sheets, glaciers. And we also have, we change how much space the ocean takes up. So warmer ocean takes up more space. And we also change the water storage on land. So all these things contribute to our sea level rise. And the amount each of those contribute is different depending on our emission scenarios. So in the top here, we have the business as usual emission scenario. And so you have all those different contributions adding to sea level rise. And below there, that's our immediate cut emissions, the 2.6. And so I suppose the key takeaway from this is that we've already made significant changes to our atmosphere. We saw that in the previous graph. And sea level rise is really going to happen. So when we start to think about climate change and sea level rise, it's quite depressing. We think, what can we do? And the good thing is that there are some practical things that we can do that are available to us right now. But when we talk about these solutions, it's important to know that nothing replaces limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So we can't just keep releasing CO2 and hope that nature will be able to absorb all of it. We really need to have our first point of call is that we limit greenhouse gas emissions almost immediately. It's that dire. We also want to conserve the biodiversity and the complex ecosystems which exist in the world today already. We really want to stop that land destruction. We want to stop deforestation because all these activities also continue to contribute to carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions to our atmosphere. But we do need to find ways to capture the 300 gigatons of CO2 and growing each year as we transition out of this, out of the use of fossil fuels that is already there. And so some of the solutions, as I said, are already available to us. And we'll be talking about one of those today, and that's our blue carbon ecosystems. And I'll pass over now to Sophie for the next bit.
So that leads us to the question, how can blue carbon ecosystems help with this challenge of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? So I'd like to start with the first question that I often get when talking about blue carbon ecosystems. Is the carbon actually blue? And the answer is no. It's just called blue carbon because it refers to the ocean and ocean's ecosystems. So blue carbon can mean the carbon that's stored in the deep ocean, but today we're going to be talking about coastal blue carbon. So when I say coastal blue carbon, the ecosystems that we're referring to range from the subtidal seagrasses all the way up through mangroves and intertidal salt marshes up to the supratidal forests, which are kind of that upper limit of the tidal frame where the salty water reaches to. And so these ecosystems are amazing at storing carbon, and they're good at this for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're highly productive ecosystems. They produce a lot of organic matter and material as the plants are growing. They're also really good at accumulating sediment. So there's tidal creeks in all of these ecosystems where particles and soil are washing in, whether that's off the land and being trapped there or coming in from the ocean. And so that allows this material to build up in these ecosystems. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the soils are wet a lot of the time, if not all of the time, as Emily mentioned. And so this can help stop the breakdown of organic material once it's in the soils. Like us, a lot of microbes need oxygen to survive and thrive and work really well. So when they're covered by water all the time, this is what we call an anoxic environment or low oxygen environment. And that stops the microbes from working really effectively at breaking down the material and allows it to stay in the soil for a really long time. So they're really good at addressing climate change, but why are they any better than any other forest? We've known for a long time that forests are really good at storing carbon. You can see in the graph here a couple of the key blue carbon ecosystems, mangrove, salt marsh, and seagrass, and the amount of carbon that they store compared to a couple of ecosystems, forest ecosystems that we find on land. And you can see that the bars are drastically higher in these ecosystems because of some of those reasons that I talked about. So how do they actually do this? How does this process work? Well, as the plants are growing, they're photosynthesizing, getting energy from the sun to grow their plant material. And when they do this, they absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into their plant tissues, including the leaves, and the trunks, and the stems of the plants. This is called the above ground biomass of carbon. And then while these ecosystems are growing, some of the leaves and branches and things naturally fall off, they degenerate, they get washed in from other ecosystems, and they can enter the soil. And that's where they're able to stay for a really long time. So it's this kind of cycle, it's part of the global carbon cycle, but a large portion of that carbon is getting locked away in coastal blue carbon ecosystems. So here's another diagram that I like to show when talking about these ecosystems that also shows a couple of those key pathways of carbon storage into the plants and the soil, but it also shows that we live in these areas, particularly in Australia, but globally. People love to live by the ocean. And so these are really important ecosystems, not just for their carbon storage, but you can see a couple of those key co-benefits of the ecosystems up the top there. So it's really important when we're talking about blue carbon ecosystems to understand that it's not just carbon storage that's important. Blue carbon ecosystems you can think of a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. Knife is what's in the name, but what makes a Swiss Army knife so useful is that it's got all of these other tools. There's scissors, there's a corkscrew, there's a bottle opener, a screwdriver. In a similar way, carbon is what's in the name of blue carbon, but the really important things they provide us are these other co-benefits or ecosystem services. So some of the really key ones are listed on the screen here. They provide habitat to support biodiversity of threatened species and commercially important species of fish and birds and crustaceans. They also provide a service of shoreline protection. So with climate change, we'll see sea levels rising and increased frequency and severity of storm events, and they can help protect some of that, buffering the coast. They're also able to improve the air and water quality of the ecosystem by filtering out some of the excess nutrients. They provide food security and support the economy through fishing, tourism, and agriculture by providing this habitat for key species that are really important. And so this is what's really key to remember with blue carbon ecosystems. The carbon is an amazing function they provide us of storing and helping us address climate change, but they also provide all of these other ecosystem services that really bundle it up to make it this really useful tool. I'll hand over to Emily to talk about some of the projects that we've got going on in South Australia.
Thanks, Sophie. All right. So the government in South Australia has been really proactive. So knowing the benefits and a couple of projects which are starting up, they really started to understand that blue carbon ecosystems were going to be really important for our state. So in 2019, they released the Blue Carbon Strategy for our state here in South Australia. And this was a really key policy that was released by the government that really allowed research into blue carbon to forge forward in our state. And that's because we actually have some great areas which we can look at along our coastline that are going to be great blue carbon storage areas. And so the strategy allowed blue carbon pilot demonstration projects, some of which we'll talk about next, and really allowed researchers like us to identify areas that would be most suitable for protection and rehabilitation. And so, and really started that research to look into the co-benefit and the valuation of that blue carbon ecosystems and where we can most utilise those benefits. It also allowed partnerships between the government through academia, where we work, and also through NGOs and community groups. So we can start with a policy like this, we can start to work together to have really good outcomes for blue carbon ecosystems. Probably most of all is that it allows blue carbon ecosystems to be integrated within coastal planning and coastal policy and management. And so the value of these ecosystems reaches, I suppose, a greater degree within future planning scenarios for our state. So when we look at our coast and think, oh, a marina can go here, we think, well, actually, maybe that's not such a good place for that. Maybe we should value this blue carbon ecosystem because it's providing us both carbon storage, but also those biodiversity elements and co-benefits that Sophie spoke about. So this was a really key part of the strategy for our state. And so from that was released funding, which helps researchers to look at different areas of the coast and see what is possible along our coastline, and also improve the knowledge of which areas are performing the best, which areas should we protect, which areas should we rehabilitate. And so since 2020, there's been 14 projects funded, and a couple of those we'll speak about later. And they really focus on this research and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems. So this funding has been incredibly important, and that piece of policy really has driven blue carbon interest within our state.
Thanks, Em. So now I'm going to talk about one of the projects that I'm working on that's been funded by this Green Adelaide Blue Carbon Futures Fund. So this is some Port River seagrass restoration that we're working on in collaboration with the Regenerating Our Coast program at Deakin University, supported by Beach Energy. So those of you living in Adelaide might be familiar with the Port River. It's just north of the city, and it's surrounded by a lot of industry. But there's been efforts in the last sort of decade to really improve the water quality in the Port River and the Barker Inlet. And what that's led to is the seagrass naturally expanding. So with improved water quality, the seagrass is able to grow more effectively. And so you can see in the map on the left here, we've got the distribution or where the seagrass is growing. In the green, you can see where it was in 2010. And this area was just expanding and expanding all the way up to this orange distribution that we see in 2020. So this was really, really positive. And what that expansion in seagrass correlates with is an expansion in the amount of carbon stored as well. So in the graph here, you can see in this kind of sandy coloured bar, the amount of carbon that's stored in an ecosystem that's just bare sand. There's no plant material growing there. And then in the teal colour in the middle, you can see there's an increase in the carbon that's stored where the seagrass that's been growing for not so long, for about 4 or 5 years. This is seagrass that established around 2016. And then in the bar on the right, this big green bar, double the size of the others, you can see how much carbon is stored in seagrass that has been growing there for a really long time. So this shows us that we can see this progression of carbon storage. As the seagrass grows, that carbon storage will increase to this large amount we see on the right. Unfortunately, there was a really severe heat wave that happened in the start of 2023, and that just happened to line up with a period of really low tide, which left this seagrass that grows in the intertidal zone really exposed to the heat stress. And that unfortunately killed off a large area of seagrass. So in the map on the left here, from 2020, you can see all this dark area just off the coast is seagrass. And then by mid-2023, it was all gone. This is bare sand now, all the way along the river here. And so what we're doing with the funding for this project is trialling a method of restoring some of the seagrass in this red circled area up the top there. So the way that we're restoring this seagrass is with something called a BEAST structure, which stands for Biodegradable Ecosystem Restoration Elements. And what this is, you can see an image in the bottom right there. It's a lattice-like structure that's made out of potato starch that will eventually break down and biodegrade into the ecosystem. But while it's there, it provides a stable sediment for the seagrass to be able to establish, which is an issue when there's been the seagrass loss, is that the sand has a lot of movement with the tide, and so the seagrass struggles to naturally re-establish. In the top left here, you can see a beautiful, healthy meadow of seagrass at low tide, which is just further down the river and wasn't affected by the dieback event. And then down the bottom there is our study site where there was seagrass until recently. And so we're burying these structures and taking transplants of seagrass from the healthy meadow further up the river and putting them in at this new site. And you can see one of the transplants in the top right there. We just take what we call a core of seagrass and essentially have like a little plant that we can then plop into these transplant locations. So on the left there, you can see an image of one of these BEAST structures with the holes cut into it where we're going to place the seagrass after we've buried them, and also a map showing how we kind of lay these out along the river. So we've got them spaced out, and with the structures that we've buried, some of them we're keeping without any transplants in them to see if the structure providing that stabilization on its own is going to help the seagrass re-establish. And then we've also got bare control patches. So these are just bare patches of sand nearby that we're also monitoring just to see if any natural recruitment of seagrass will happen without any intervention. So we're really monitoring kind of the benefit of our structures here. And so on the left, you can see what it looks like when we're installing these structures. We go out at the lowest tides and dig a shallow hole where we can put the structures in and bury them just below the surface so that they're not too visible. And then on the right, you can see what they look like after we've transplanted the seagrass into them. So you can see there's lots of two where we planted the seagrass, and then in those bare patches, there's still a structure below there that we haven't planted anything in. And this is to see, like I said, if it's making a difference just having the structure there. We planted these seagrass transplants about a month ago, a bit more than that, and we're going to continually go out and monitor them and see the health of them, how well they're establishing, and if this is going to help the seagrass come back. And that's what we really hope to be able to see, is that the seagrass will be able to expand once we put some healthy seagrass back here, and hopefully one day it'll be a big, thick, healthy meadow again that's supporting that carbon storage functionality, as well as some of those other biodiversity metrics that we've talked about. So now I'm going to hand over back to Emily to talk about some salt marsh and mangrove restoration that's happening.
All right, so the next part of the talk is we'll talk about the Dry Creek salt fields, and we'll talk about sort of the area and some projects which have happened in the area and are now starting to happen with the new Green Adelaide funded project. So just as a start for where are we talking about, so this is where the Dry Creek salt fields are in relation to the Adelaide CBD. And I'm always surprised where people actually don't realise that this salt mine actually exists within our state and is so close to the Adelaide CBD. And so the salt mine takes about 30 kilometres of our coast and reaches from Middle Beach up here in the north right down to Dry Creek in the south. And so the site in total is about 5,500 hectares. So it's absolutely massive, and you can see there it's right along the coast and butts up against natural mangrove ecosystems. So the salt fields was established in the 1930s, and it's a process of solar evaporation. So how it operates is that seawater is pumped in through the top, and so the different salinities you can see in the colours there, and it is pumped or flows in a southerly direction, and as it moves through the system, it evaporates with the sun, so naturally evaporates and gets more and more concentrated as it flows through the chain of ponds down to this area down the bottom, which is called the crystallizers. so it crystallises there. Common salt, NaCl, halite, and so that's how the system works. So as it concentrates, different salts drop out along the system until eventually you get pure salt at the bottom. And so the salt fields actually stopped production in 2013, like late 2013-14. And that's because their main customer for the salt, their only customer, actually shut down with the Penrice Osborne soda ash plant. And so without that customer anymore, there wasn't at that time any market for the salt. And so the site was actually sold, but it still has a mining lease over it. But in the interim time, because this area had established quite important bird habitat in these ponds, so when they were shallow and particular and regular salinity, they actually provided a habitat for birds and an ecosystem within those ponds. And so it was decided to keep the holding pattern in place, and it has been in place since 2013. And so at the moment, seawater is pumped in through the top and it flows down the system like it used to. But it's pumped out through the Bolivar Channel and mixes with water from Bolivar and gets discharged at an appropriate limit that the EPA monitors out into the Gulf. And so it reduces salinity back down to 45 grams per litre. So it's below seawater when it comes out here. These areas in Section 2 and Section 1 down the bottom have been dried out, and there are various filling activities down here, especially on the freehold land. And so there is freehold and Crown land amongst this, but importantly, it still has a mineral lease or mining lease over it. So that is still an active lease. And so the resumption of salt mining could happen if the landowner and the leaseholder so chooses to do that. But as a researcher who works in mangrove and salt marsh habitat, I look at this site and go, this is an amazing site with suitable elevation for mangrove and salt marsh habitat. And that's what we'll be talking about today. And so with that in mind, back from 2015 to 2017, a project was started up to think about, okay, if we didn't have salt mining at this site anymore, what other land use could this site support? But before we drain it and do sorts of things, we probably should do a bit of a trial to see what might work. And so this pond here was chosen as a trial site, and we call that X8A. And you can see a couple of key things about this site. It's right against the coast. It has a tidal creek right up against it. And it's quite small. And so any drainage activities that were going to come out of this, the volume of that salty water that came out initially was going to be a lower volume than some of these more northern ponds. And so this was a project which was a joint initiative between various state government departments. So Environment for Water, the Natural Resource Management Boards at the time, Department for Mining, University of Adelaide, Flinders, the Land and Leaseholder, and also the Gordy Institute of Research. And if you want to read more about this particular trial, there's a QR code there on the screen, and I think there'll be an email sent out with more information for you with clickable links. And so how did it start? Well, the pond, before it was drained down here, was 3 times seawater. And so the main issue at this time was, if you're going to open and drain this out to the adjacent coastline, we really don't want to have any impact on that adjoining ecosystem. And so these tidal gates were installed. And the main reason for these tidal gates is that as the monitoring program, there was an intensive monitoring program as the pond was drained. If any impacts were observed, you could shut those gates and then all action stopped. But actually what was found in the really intensive monitoring program was that the water that was coming out of the pond diluted quite quickly with the tides. And so there was no impact observed through the adjoining ecosystem during that drainage phase, which was really a positive step. We could see that the ecosystem could cope with that pulse out of salty water for that short period of time in those low volumes, which is really key. And so this down here is what the pond looked like upon drainage. You can see it's not so great. And so moving on to this is what the initial drainage looked like in 2017. So this is the water flowing out through those tidal gates over the edge of under the bund, sorry. And these are some new map images of the pond when it was full and when just after it was drained. And importantly, I want you to just concentrate on this area in the background, what it looked like. And so this is what it looks like today. So we went out about a month ago, we took some drone imagery, and this is what has happened. And the most important thing I want, I suppose, as a takeaway from this is just the tide. This is the only thing here that was put into this pond was the tide was reintroduced. There was no revegetation works, nothing like that. All it was opening the site up to the tide, letting the tide come in twice a day, flush in and flush out. So all the revegetation that happened here was natural regeneration. And so up the top there's the progress of the vegetation over the different years, some near map images. And you can see that it took a while to get going. But once the ecosystem started to recover and the soils and sediments flushed out those salts, vegetation started to grow. And in the most recent monitoring at this site, we're starting to see mangrove emergence 7 years later, which is really exciting. And so, of course, there was a big monitoring program which we put in place at this site, and we wanted to monitor both the above ground biomass and also the below ground biomass in terms of carbon storage. And so we had these long-term monitoring sites, and this is what it looks like. We take soil cores and then we retake those soil cores over time and send them off to the lab and measure how much carbon's in it. At the same time, we work with a big team and who measured the above ground biomass and also different aspects of biodiversity at the site. And so this is a graph here just of tonnes of carbon per hectare. And you can see here, this is only after 3 years. And so we have some new data, which is just actually being analysed at the lab at the moment. And we hope to extend that graph out to 7 years soon. But you can see there the increase in total tonnes of carbon per hectare 3 years after the introduction of tidal flow, just quite remarkable. And so I've got a bit some more drone imagery here showing the pond, and you can see down here this is on the tide coming out when we went out there and what it looks like today. And I suppose the most important thing about this trial site is it's a living proof of concept for this area of what is possible if we just let in the tide. And it's a quite remarkable demonstration of that. The other thing I want to get across is that you can see this area in the background. This is the rest of the salt fields, and it's a big area. So we actually have a great potential here as well. So going back to sea level rise, as I talked about earlier, you might be thinking, okay, you talked about sea level rise earlier, no matter what we do now, we're going to see it. And so naturally, these ecosystems are going to be affected because they're right on the coast. And so if we model this particular pond, and this is work done by the Salt to Sea Water Project, we model this pond and say, okay, in our largest emission scenario, which is business as usual, by 2100, this site's going to be underwater. And so what does that mean for our carbon storage? If we transition to open water over the next 100 years, we're not going to be continuing to store carbon in these soils, and we might lose that above ground biomass. So there is an impermanence in that carbon sequestration due to sea level rise. And there was some work done to sort of try and estimate that. The good thing, the amazing thing about mangrove or blue carbon ecosystems in general is they can actually build up behind them. So when you're looking at blue carbon ecosystems, because they pull sediments in that flow into an ecosystem, they can actually keep up with things like sea level rise. And so there's been some really good research done that shows that the systems can accrete, they can build up ecosystems and move inland with sea level rise, which is really exciting. But of course, this is only possible if we have no barriers. And at the moment, we have these big bun walls around this particular trial site that will prevent that ecosystem from moving inland. So what do? We start to look at the salt fields as a whole. And so luckily, at this particular site, this is the whole of the section 3, the middle section of the Dry Creek salt fields. And looking at different elevation, we can actually model the ecosystems that will occur depending on their elevation as sea level rise starts to impact this coastal zone. And we can see the potential for future carbon storage and all the biodiversity benefits of blue carbon ecosystems as we face sea level rise. The other thing about blue carbon ecosystems is They are an incredible barrier to erosion, coastal erosion. So we know that coastal erosion happens with sea level rise. Storm surges can start to erode our coastal zone, and we like to live on the coast, and so that's a risk to human populations. The good thing about blue carbon ecosystems is they are like a protective barrier. They absorb wave energy and actually prevent coastal erosion. So it is in our best interest, if we are going to build on the coast, to have these type of ecosystems in front of any infrastructure which we have. So we know we have Bolivar, our wastewater treatment system right on the coast here. If we have a blue carbon ecosystem in front of that, then we are actually protecting our infrastructure into the future. And we all know that humans love to build big walls. Walls are problematic on the coast, and time again we see walls being eroded by the tide. Mangrove and blue carbon ecosystems are the most effective barrier to sea level rise and coastal erosion. So we have a double whammy here. And so that leads me into my current project, which I'm working on, which is funded by Green Adelaide as part of the Blue Carbon Futures Grant. And so we're working at the moment with Flinders University and also the land and leaseholder, Buckland Dry Creek. And so what we're doing here is we're starting to look at the future opportunities for this site in the long term. So at the moment, the company might decide if they find a market for salt, they'd like to resume salt mining, and that is within their rights to do that, of course, being the leaseholder. But we want to look beyond that. So when we're thinking about sea level rise, we're thinking about decades into the future. We know this site is going to be impacted by sea level rise. We can see the modelling shows it. So how can we prepare for that into the future? And luckily, there is actually a comparable site in the Bay of San Francisco, and they are transitioning a salt field slowly over time to blue carbon ecosystems. But importantly, their project is a 40-year project. So when we're thinking long term, that's the type of long term that we need to be thinking about for this particular site. But if we get ahead of it and we start to plan in advance, then really we can realise these benefits which we've talked about today. But we know at this particular site, there are quite severe environmental hazards. We have a whole lot of hypersaline water that we need to deal with no matter what change any future land use beyond salt mining. We have to deal with the salty water that is there already. And so coming to this project, we need to plan what strategy we use to deal with that salty water over a number of years. Where do we put it? How do we dilute it? How do we dry out these ponds in a safe manner? Which ponds we open up to the tide at what particular scenario? So do we do this one first and then that one in a progressive fashion? And how do we prevent any environmental hazards happening as we do that? So we know in 2020, this is section 2 here, this is right next to St Kilda, water was put in here at a higher level than the bunds were able to cope with. And so what we saw was hypersaline brine plume actually go out through the under the bund and into the mangrove and salt marsh ecosystem adjacent this site, causing a large-scale die-off. And so what this shows us is we have to be really careful in how we manage the change of land use at this site. And so we have to know the hazards that are there, and we also need to have a lot of research into how we manage that and have a strategy and a plan for what sections we do when. And the other thing we have at this site, as you have at most coastal sites, is acid sulfate soils, which really need to not be dried out. So we have to maintain a level of sediment moistness, I suppose, in the soils to prevent the dry out of acid sulfate soils. So importantly, these are barriers to our remediation that we have to manage as we move forward. But the potential is there, and the best thing about the site at XB8A is that it shows it's a living proof of concept about what is actually possible just through opening up these sites to the tide in a strategic fashion, and monitoring and research, and what monitoring and research can really do for the future of these type of ecosystems. And importantly, we have this huge area here that not only can sequester carbon, it can provide a value in terms of biodiversity and all the co-benefits we talked about, but also a coastal protection for our infrastructure which we build behind it. So there's a whole range of important things that these ecosystems provide for us. And hopefully in the future we'll be able to see lots of different change at this particular site. And there's another link down there to the report. And I'll hand over now to Sophie to talk about another project.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to talk about one more seagrass restoration project that we've got going on. This one's further up the coast off Port Gawler, and it's much larger scale than the one that I talked about earlier. And you can see some of our project partners along the bottom here. So this is quite a large project with lots of people involved. So, similar to the Port River, there was a seagrass dieback off the coast further north of Adelaide, and this was due again to poor water quality. But again, in recent years, we've seen a reversal of that. There's been a lot of work done to treat our wastewater better and manage the nutrients that flow into the environment. And so all that's preventing the seagrass from growing off the coast now is being able to establish, like I mentioned earlier, for the seagrass, it needs that stable surface for the seeds to hold on to. And so the way that we're restoring the seagrass on this much larger scale offshore in deeper waters is by using these sand-filled Hessian bags that we drop off the boat, like you can see on the left here, all the piles of bags. Some of these bags are filled with seeds of seagrass, and others are just dropped to provide that stable habitat for the seagrass that's already living around the area to naturally release seeds into, so they can hold on to the bags and establish. So these sandbags have covered about 20 hectares, so quite a large restoration for seagrass we're talking about here. And so for this project, we're using something called the System of Environmental Economic Accounting. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's just a way for us to value this ecosystem and how we're restoring the seagrass is going to benefit a number of different factors. So some of the key things that we're measuring with this environmental accounting is the carbon sequestration, so how much carbon is going to be stored in the soil of this seagrass compared to when it was just bare sand, the biodiversity and what's living in the area, the water filtration services that the seagrass will provide, the nutrients it takes out of the water, also any benefits to coastal protection, because the seagrass, not as well as the mangroves, but can lessen the wave energy and reduce the energy that's reaching the mangroves. And also any benefits to recreational fishing. So those fish that grow up and live in these ecosystems are supporting recreational fishers having a stop to go and fish. And so there's a number of different ways that we do this monitoring. We've got scuba divers going out and taking soil cores, but what we do to measure the biodiversity is take surveys with trawling. So we go out on the boat, and I'm going out again next week, excitingly, hope the weather's good, and we drop a modified trawling net and collect the fish that are growing in the seagrass and the bare sand so that we can compare the two areas. We pick up the fish and get them in a bucket of water on the back of the boat, as you can see on the left here, and we ID the different species that we've got and count them, and then drop them back into the ocean. So this way we can monitor what's living in these ecosystems and how much life is it really supporting. So you can see some of the really cool finds we've got here. On the top right, we've got a little seahorse, there's an ornate cowfish, pufferfish, and one of my favourites down here is the little decorator crab that just likes to stick seagrass and algae to himself as a form of camouflage. And so another way that we can do this monitoring of the biodiversity that's living in the seagrass is with baited remote underwater videos. So this basically involves getting a GoPro and attaching it to a frame, which we drop off the side of the boat, but that also has some bait on it that can attract the fish. And so this is a way to monitor some of the bigger species that we're not likely to catch in our net. So you can see, again, some really cool species we found here. There's the blue swimmer crab, southern calamari, a Port Jackson shark, and one of our more exciting captures on camera was a great white shark. And so what we're hoping to do with this project is really show the full diversity of what's going on in these ecosystems and how restoring seagrass can benefit us, not just for carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation, but also for supporting biodiversity and providing other benefits to humans, like the recreational fishing. And so this is a really exciting project where we're hopefully going to be able to demonstrate the great impact that having this restoration will have, and show that we need to do more of these projects. It's really a demonstration of what can be achieved and how we can measure and show the difference that restoring these habitats will make. All right, coming back over to Emily now, just to wrap this up.
So to wrap up, I just wanted to provide some key takeaways about blue carbon ecosystems. And so I hope you've been able to understand that blue carbon ecosystems are really efficient at taking carbon from the atmosphere and locking it away underground. And so they're very much more carbon per acre than terrestrial ecosystems. And carbon, of course, is really, really important, but also those co-benefits can't be forgotten. When we're talking about blue carbon ecosystems, it's more than just carbon, blue carbon. The biodiversity benefits both for our economy and for our environment and our society are just massive. Importantly, they also protect our coastlines from erosion, storm surges, and sea level rise. And so they have this multi-use. We have huge potential here in South Australia, and the government strategy, the blue carbon strategy, has been key for blue carbon research in our state and action and showing what is possible in our state here in South Australia. So I hope you've been able to learn something today about blue carbon, learn what's happening within our state, some really interesting and exciting research happening for lots of different groups, and we appreciate the opportunity to be able to tell you about it today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophie and Emily. That was just incredibly insightful. I've learned a lot, and you've absolutely sold me on the benefits of blue carbon. I was aware of the carbon sequestration, but I didn't. That's completely new to me to learn about how the mangroves can actually adapt and kind of migrate with the rising tide. Incredible. And I hadn't really thought about the buffer that those systems are, the opportunity for them to protect people living kind of near the coast and provide that really essential protection, and as you say, better than any wall can probably provide. So please, if you have any questions of Emily and Sophie, I will invite you to pop those into the Q&A now while we have some time to pick your brains. Yep. Personally, I'm interested, while we wait for some of those questions to come through, I'm curious, if a salt marsh, it's not the sexiest of thing to kind of talk about and to sell. Do you feel through the work that's happening, are we really getting somewhere with raising the awareness of the importance of these ecosystems, or do you feel it's still a bit of a hard sell in trying to, educate community, developers, business, government on the importance of these ecosystems?
I was just going to say, I mean, this seminar is a great opportunity to kind of do that and kind of show what these ecosystems can provide, because they definitely can have a bit of a bad reputation. Lots of people think they can be a bit smelly and there's mozzies there. But you can see, I mean, in your background, a beautiful salt marsh there. And it's something that we get to experience getting out in the field. Although we're often knee deep in the mud, we do get to really appreciate these ecosystems and the diversity of what's living there. Which is difficult when it is such a muddy environment that often there's not a lot of access to. So it's hard for people to get out and see that. So opportunities like this to really show people what is right on our doorstep is really exciting.
Yeah, I think, they need a PR campaign for sure. But really, because you have to get out there to experience that. Before I did my PhD in the coastal systems, I'd always been interested in the coast, but I never had that time and appreciation of actually spending big chunks, which I do when I go out and do field work in these ecosystems, especially along our northern coast. I think it's quite a hidden gem of our state, and one I'd encourage you to go out to. The quiet and the sense of peace when you're out there. It's a beautiful ecosystem. Yes, take your mozzie repellent for sure, but spend more time out there and you'll start to realise the beauty, the quiet beauty that these ecosystems have, and the real benefits they have to us as a community. And so if we can start to open up these areas for people to experience in a positive way, then we can encourage their restoration. So less marinas and more blue carbon ecosystems, for sure.
Mm. And it's really quite incredible to think, when I'm looking at this system, to really imagine that is sequestering kind of 4 times the carbon of a similar terrestrial system. That's really quite hard to kind of conceptualize, I think, and really value and understand all of that carbon that is being held there. Something else.
There's a lot of research around Australia, all from all different areas, and we're connected in with the blue carbon researchers from around Australia. And as the research builds in this area, we can really see the power of that sequestration benefit, essentially because of their biogeochemistry.
And I think the projects that you have shared today just really highlight how important it is to have researchers involved in doing what you're doing, to have these proof of concepts. Like, that is just so powerful to yeah, to be able to show the work of what's possible with the mangroves and the salt fields there, to be able to show and prove, I guess, how we can restore our grassland ecosystems. I mean, marine grassland. Am I saying that right? Marine grassland ecosystems, seagrass ecosystems. Yeah, incredibly important. So, is there, what's happening internationally, and are we seeing the attention that these systems deserve, do you think, now, and kind of around us? You're mentioning connection with other researchers around Australia. What is happening kind of on that international level? You mentioned the salt fields, I think, in San Francisco. So is this a global movement we're seeing?
Yeah, so absolutely. So in terms of areas, so like these ecosystems don't cover huge areas, but for the areas they do cover, they actually are very powerful, as we've seen. And so as we move towards what are we going to do about climate change, everyone's desperately looking for solutions about what we can do. And so what's really interesting to see with their I suppose, their carbon abatement, their shoreline protection, and also their biodiversity, a lot of small nations and small island nations are really getting involved, and they're getting their communities involved in protecting these ecosystems for their own productivity in terms of fisheries and the like, but also as a strategy for their country to be able to work towards climate goals. And so, and the recognition that they're not just something to come in and destroy, as we have done a lot through European history, and put walls and bunds and all these sort of things in place, either protecting what we have, looking at areas that can be restored. Once we have that research and internationally and in Australia, we can really start to see those benefits, and then more and more people catch on, and more people want to protect them, and then governments get involved. But I think the important thing, what we've shown in South Australia, is having a policy, having a strategy around these ecosystems was really key in driving that research. The funding that groups like we have allow us to go out. Funding from Green Adelaide allows our research groups to go out and really have a look and see what is possible. And that's been a really key part, and should be celebrated within our state at a government level.
Yeah, and that's really important because it is a global movement. It's definitely being recognised in lots of different countries that have these ecosystems. But they do vary a lot depending on where you are in the globe and the climatic conditions that you're growing in. So down here in South Australia, we've only got one species of mangrove. But up in Queensland, they have a heap and in the more tropical areas. So it's really important that we have this research in all of the different areas that we have these ecosystems, so that we can really understand what the benefit is in our unique environment.
I just realized there was actually quite a few questions coming through, and I didn't realize. So my apologies, everybody. I'll get to your questions right now. So what are the opportunities for these projects to be used as offsets for other organisations? And I did have a similar thought with the salt fields. At what point does that become more economical as carbon credits, I guess, potentially, rather than a salt field? Or what are your thoughts on offsets?
That's a growing market, and so we have both carbon offsets, but we also have this emerging, as Sophie talked about, this environmental economic reporting. So a big part of our project, our Green Adelaide funded project, is on salt fields for future opportunities. Is we have a team of environmental economists working with us from Flinders who can look at all those different aspects of future land use and go, okay, let's weigh this up. Let's say if we do this at this particular site, this gives us this economic benefit. But what if we do this? What does that give us in terms of not just, I suppose, an industry, but more environmentally in terms of carbon abatement, biodiversity credits? What does it give us in terms of tourism benefits and green space, stormwater management? So there's a whole lot of things that can be costed and then be compared against a pure industry example. And so carbon abatement measure, I suppose, credits and also biodiversity credits are an important part of this. And as we show what is possible and what could be possible, then we can get people interested into sites like this and go, wow, this is what this particular place could support, as opposed to what it's doing now. Oh, you're just on mute still.
Thank you. My dog started barking. I have someone interested in whether you might have an honours project available in the area of blue carbon. Maybe we can add some information about how to get in contact with you in the email out to everybody. So we'll get back to you on that one. When the dieback event occurred, did that release the CO2 that the seagrass had captured and stored?
That's a very good point. Yes, any decomposition activities definitely release carbon dioxide and also methane back to the atmosphere as well. And so that wasn't measured. We didn't have any research projects around that. We did measure the salt contaminant in the soil and how it sort of changed over time. But definitely any sort of decomposing vegetation will release CO2 back to the atmosphere. So it wasn't a massive area of dieback, but it was definitely, it showed the care we need to take with this particular site, given it's right up against some really sensitive and important ecosystems. And so we need to take that into account and prevent it from happening again, because that is a really incredibly important place for a lot of South Australians, the mangrove boardwalk, and it was a devastating thing to see for sure.
Great. I'm having to rapid fire these to try and get through them, so my apologies.
Yep.
What is the geographic scope of the New Futures Opportunities project?
The Green Adelaide Blue Carbon Futures Fund specifically.
I'm not sure. It just says the Future Opportunities project.
Okay, so I mean, so we've got 5,500 hectares. Some of that will not all of it will be blue carbon ecosystems. So we're particularly looking at those ponds that are the seaward side, because their elevation will immediately start to support these ecosystems in them. Some of them are more in the supratidal area, so they'll take a bit longer to establish. And so there might be complementary land uses which we have in the meantime, as we have sea level rise and that type of thing. But we're particularly focused on the seaward side ponds, but also looking at what could be done on the landward side ponds as we transition out of that. So is there potential for a smaller scale salt field, which is what they did in San Francisco Bay. So they have both industries occurring, I suppose industries, we call it that, but there's salt mining, but also transition happening at the same time. So I think it's important when we look at this site, it's not going to happen immediately. And I hope I got that across. It's like it's a stage process. And we know what's possible, and it's how we work towards that is, I suppose, what my research is looking at.
Great. I've had someone ask, they said that they'd love to get involved in the biodiversity assessments that you're doing when you're trawling for biodiversity. Just broadly, what opportunities are there for volunteers to get involved around these types of projects, or the blue carbon marine projects in general?
Yeah, so unfortunately the trawling is very popular. We have a number of researchers that of course have to be on board, and we do take out some volunteers from the university as well, but yeah, very popular field work. So we get less volunteers for being out in the mud, unfortunately. I'm not quite sure why. But there definitely are opportunities throughout the state. There's the Seeds for Snapper program run by Ozfish, where you can, you have to look them up. We can send that link out in the email that comes afterwards. But you can help collecting seeds along the shoreline of seagrasses that then will be planted out to help re-establish the seagrass. And that's not exactly how we do it for the project that I'm working on, but that's a really important community, community organisations that you can get out and help there.
Also, I just want to mention there's some really strong community groups around the Barker Inlet, the Port River, around Port Adelaide, really, really engaged community around this area. So I would encourage you to contact Port Adelaide Infield Council or some of the councils to get a list of those community groups that do really important work around the Barker Inlet and all of the area that we talked about today.
Great. Well, we can put some of those contact details together in the email that comes out. That's all we've got time for. If we didn't get to your question, we'll put something in the email to everybody to answer any questions that we missed. But on that note of talking about volunteers, I would like to acknowledge the huge work of volunteers all up and down the coast of this land, of Kaurna land, working really hard together with council and government and Kaurna and researchers to care for these coastal systems, and the coastal team at Green Adelaide as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Emily Leyden and Dr. Sophie Russell, and to everyone who joined us live or be watching this later. We'll get that email out to you soon. Our next session in this series is How to Beat the Urban Heat with Sarah White from Green Adelaide, and that will be coming up on Wednesday, November 20. So I'll send you an invite to that and some more information. But thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. See ya.